Thank you. As you might be able to tell, I am an American. There is a rule in America that you can only speak one language, and I speak English. So I apologize for not being able to communicate with you in Spanish. My wife, she speaks Spanish, but she is an ornery woman, and she refuses to translate for me. I speak many ancient languages, some of which are probably relevant for some of you in the audience. Languages like Fortran and COBOL and PL1 and Pascal, and the list goes on. I find those languages do me no service now. A couple of comments by way of introduction. I apologize for missing the workshops yesterday. There was an ice storm in Dallas, and our flights were canceled, so we were here a day late. So I apologize for missing those workshops. I want to thank the Congress, and particularly Dr. Roberto de la Torre Sanchez, for inviting me to this important conference, this beautiful campus, and this very pleasant town. I've known Roberto for almost 35 years now, and this is the first chance I've had to come to his university, and I'm sorry I have not come before, because it's very pleasant. I also think that this conference is very important, and we will talk a little bit about some of the things that are happening around the rest of the world that might impact the very needs you have here with the Congress in Mexico with your universities. I am from Pearson. Many of you will know Pearson because of our textbooks. We are the publisher of many, many very expensive textbooks. The good news is I am not here to sell you anything. What you might not know about Pearson are the other things we do in education around the world. One is we are also the publisher of reading materials under our Penguin publication title. We own Penguin Press. Another thing that we do is we publish the Financial Times. It's that peach newspaper that is all the rage in Europe. The thing that you probably don't know about Pearson is that we provide assessments and evaluations in almost every country in the world, and that we partner with local venues to build assessments and evaluations that are applicable to the needs in the various countries we work in. So for example, Pearson publishes and builds the Australian literacy assessment and numeracy assessment that's used across all of Australia. We also build the problem-solving assessment as well as the joint entrance examination in India. These are assessments students in India use to get into graduate school or undergraduate school. In China, we own Wall Street English and the Pearson Test of English, artifacts that compete against TOEFL for entry into universities in China. In the United States, we support the ACT assessment, the SAT assessment, as well as almost every state assessment in one way or another. All of these assessments I am responsible for. I spend my whole life traveling all over the world trying to explain the value of assessment, particularly assessment enhanced by technology, and its advantages to improving education and learning. In the Arab Gulf, I spend most of my time trying to convince the Arab Gulf countries of the value of education. I spend a lot of time in the UK. They don't believe in assessment in the UK. I spend a lot of time in the UK working on qualifications. The GCSE, the International, is another assessment or set of instruction with assessment that we are responsible for. In all of these countries, I'm always asked the same question. How can we use computers, how can we use technology more efficiently to be able to improve instruction? Assessment is almost a secondary consideration. Yes, we have to mark students, but our primary goal is to be able to use the computer more efficiently to improve learning. The topic I'm going to talk about today is called computer adaptive testing. It essentially uses the computer to facilitate, to make assessment, on-demand assessment, easy, cheap, and efficient. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the ramifications that might have for your very large needs, particularly around teacher evaluation and teacher certification. Let's start with adaptive testing. What is computer adaptive testing, or CAT? Very simplistically, computer adaptive testing is nothing more than the computer looking for and administering the next assessment question based on the student's previous response. So that if the student missed the previous question, the computer will search the item pool for questions that are easier than the previous one, under the assumption that the student didn't get the previous question right. They must not have known that material. From the test taker's perspective, what happens in a computer adaptive testing environment is that the students get a test that presents items that they have the best opportunity to answer. It doesn't waste their time by presenting questions that are far too difficult or far too easy for any candidate. Hence, the advantage of computer adaptive testing is we don't waste our time or the student's time on questions that are inappropriate. We'll talk a little more about that shortly. CAT uses a selection algorithm. The computer uses an algorithm to identify a question out of an available pool of questions to present to the student next. If you think about that for a minute, it sounds daunting, because now I have to have a pool of questions, and I have to have data on those questions, statistics on those questions, to tell me how difficult they are. The thing I have found amazing around the world is I'll ask professors, how many evaluations do you write in a semester? And they shake their heads, they go, oh, too many. And I say, do you pool your items? Do you, when you write a paper, when you sit to set up a paper for students, do you put them into a database or a file so that in the future you can use them again? Almost nobody does. The response I usually get is, I know what I teach and I know what I have to measure, and I write a new paper every time. If we can start being a little more systematic, we could build huge pools of test questions. We would have, because each paper that you've given the students over the years in your courses had to be marked and evaluated, so you have data about how difficult those questions are. If we could start harvesting that and putting those into a pool, it would be easy then to render those via the computer. In the United States alone, my team writes almost 400,000 new test questions every year that go into a pool that allow us then to field test and get data from that we can use to build tests. Your size pools would be much bigger if across your universities you could get your professors to put all of their marks, all of their test questions into a pool. So it's not that hard to achieve. The items in a pool have to have statistics. The most common method of calibrating those items, finding out how difficult they are, is through something called item response theory. We're not going to spend any time on item response theory today. But we have to understand that if we want computer adaptive testing to work, if we want to tailor what questions a student gets based on the student's ability, we have to have estimates of difficulty for the questions so that we can make a judgment about whether or not a student should get an easier question or a harder question. We'll have to collect that data in some manner. That's the biggest problem of computer adaptive testing, collecting that data. What happens then is very simple. Let's suppose we give that second question to the student, an easier question, and the question gets this question correct. Now I've got a student with two responses. The first one was incorrect. The second question was correct. Now the computer tries to find an item that's a little bit harder than the one the student just answered. And the computer presents that item to the student. If the student gets that item correct, he now has two correct answers in a row, and the computer finds another harder item to administer. If the student misses that, the computer then goes and finds an item that's a little bit easier. Not easier than the previous items that the student got right, but easier than the item the student just missed. You can kind of see what the computer's doing. The computer is going back and forth trying to bracket that student around questions that are too hard that they get wrong and questions that are too easy that they get right. The computer can very quickly hone in on where that point is, where the students can get more difficult questions, easier questions correct and more difficult questions incorrect. Here's a flow chart that represents just what I've talked about. So we start with the first question for a student. Typically, we don't know anything about our students, and so we start with a middle difficulty test question. We display that question on the computer to the student. The student answers. We observe and evaluate their response. If it's a multiple choice question, it's very easy. It's right or wrong. If it's a multiple choice question, it's very easy to evaluate. It's right or wrong. If it's a computerized question, a simulation, a computer experiment, if it's writing prose, if it's text that has to be evaluated, there are computerized ways in which the questions can be evaluated. That's another problem with computer adaptive testing. The questions have to be scored in real time. That is, while the student is taking the test. So they can't be the most elaborate questions that you might see on some of your teacher-built exams. After that, the computer evaluates whether or not the student got it right. They estimate, again, using item response theory, but you can just calculate the number of items correct to see whether or not the students got it right or got it wrong and how they improved their score. And then you iterate on this loop. And you stop as soon as you have some degree of confidence that you know where that student's real ability measure is. We'll see an example of this a little later on. After that, you end the exam and you either go to another section or you kick the student out of the testing situation. I did forget to mention, I do have handouts of all of my slides that you can take with you. They're in the back of the room, so when we're done, you can take the slides with you, and you'll have this information. I see a few of you scribbling notes and trying to capture some of the things, but there'll be a handout with all of that information on it. some of the advantages of CAT, because the main advantage from an administration and an examinee's point of view is that students don't have to take questions that are really too hard for them or really too easy for them. They only take questions that are appropriate level of difficulty, and we still find out how able they are. What that typically does is it allows us then to be able to tailor our assessments so that for my very poorest students, I still can ask a lot of easy questions to find out what they know and can do on the easiest questions. So I can get feedback that tells me what I, as a teacher, need to do next for a student who isn't very able. Similarly then, for my best students, who almost always ace the exam or score the highest, they will only get presented the very most challenging questions. So I'll actually be able to figure out what questions they have missed on the challenging side, on the difficult side, so that I can prepare feedback and change lessons or instructions for even my best students in the class. Because each student gets a test tailored to their difficulty, tailored to their ability level. One of the things that's very important that isn't as easy to perceive in computer adaptive testing is the measurement precision. In most exams I give in the United States, in 15 questions, I can get the same reliability as a test that has 60 questions in it. I can make the same quality decision about a student with as few as 15 items as you might be able to in a conventional test with 60 items. Now that doesn't sound like a lot unless you want to test on demand every day to be able to track student progress during instruction. Because then the brevity with which you can ascertain whether or not the students are mastering those concepts is so fast that you don't have to take away valuable instructional time for the assessment. It also helps in our licensure programs, because now I know with some degree of confidence that students have actually passed the exam because I've controlled how much confidence I have in their ability to pass based on how soon I terminate a computer adaptive test. I could allow it to go longer if I wanted more precision. Again, we'll see an example of that here in a minute. Again, this last point, everywhere around the world, people tell me, we're tired of testing paper and pencil. Our students log in and take courses online. Our students look up references online. Our students collaborate through social media online. Our tutorials are online. Yet, when I give an examination, they come into a room and sit down and have to do it on paper. There's a disconnect between how we teach and how we assess. Now, some of that, I'm quite sure, is because most people don't value assessment as part of instruction and learning. But the other part is, we don't do a good job training our teachers, we don't do a good job training our administrators on how the computer can be used to improve instruction, can improve learning by providing individual student growth trajectories about what they've been able to do in the classroom. That also helps me as a teacher then see what I need to do next around these online tutorials, intervention, and lesson plans. So we need to be able to get to a stage where our assessments are as online and technology savvy as our instruction and our remediation. And we've made huge strides in that. I don't have any to show you today, but many of our online assessments are simulations, are experiments where the students in 3 dimensions can manipulate lab experiments, can manipulate mathematical formulas, can fill out graphs, solve solution tables, can experiment with many of the ways that they would normally do on paper, all as part of the computer experience. In fact, some of our better simulations, and I'll again talk about this later, but some of our best simulations, the students don't even know they're being evaluated. They'll choose a variable to investigate, and that very choice tells me as the instructor what they know or don't know about the particular experiment that they've been introduced to. I wanted now to give one real-life example of the power of computer adaptive testing. This is a U.S. and Canada example, so I apologize that I didn't have one that was more friendly to Mexico. But in the United States, every nurse, every practicing nurse has to get a license. Every nurse has to pass a test before she's awarded a license. The name of the test is NCLEX. That test is built by Pearson. It uses our computer adaptive programs. One of the main reasons that the nursing board decided to go to NCLEX was that the exams used to take 3 days, and students would have to answer 280 questions over those 3 days. And if you think I'm boring and this talk is painful to listen to, can you imagine what it would be like if you were a nursing student looking to get a job and you had to pass this exam and you had to sit for the exam for 3 days and answer 280 questions? It would be very, very painful. So what the nursing board decided, let's use a computer adaptive test instead. Let's allow it, let's allow it to vary from as few as 60 questions up to as many as 250 if needed. Well, in order to do that, the first challenge the nursing board ran into was they had to have large item pools. They needed items, 1,500, 2,000 test questions. And they did exactly what I suggested you would do. They harvested all the questions they had ever written for any NCLEX exam and put them all into a pool. They had statistics on them, were able to use those questions. So it wasn't that they went out and started from scratch. They actually got all the existing test questions and put them into a central location for everybody to use. I won't spend much time on this. This is some of the algorithms I talked about. This happens to be a stopping algorithm that simply says, I'm going to stop when I reach some criteria. This is the standard error. This is 1.96 from the normal curve. So I want to be 95, 91% confident that when I stop the test, the student is actually above the cut score. So this is an example of a stopping rule. I'm having a little trouble with the clicker. Come on. There we go. What this looks like, let me explain this to you. So these are the number of questions the candidate takes. After 60 questions, this is the candidate's bottom edge with the error band. This is the candidate's ability estimate. This is the cut score. As soon as the student's bottom edge of the confidence interval gets above that cut score, the program is going to terminate, because the program will be confident that the student has a sufficient ability to meet the standard. So you can see what happened to this student. This student, after 66 questions, almost got above the cut, but didn't quite. So they had to take more questions. And finally, they almost made it there, and they had to take more. Finally, after 132 questions, they were able to pass. The exam terminated, students passed. 132 questions. That's half of the questions the students were going to have to take when it was that student would have had to take when it was a fixed length test. Again, before NCLEX, nurses would have to go to big cities and sit 3 days for a paper and pencil test. After NCLEX, they could go to any computer testing center within 50 miles of their home. We had so many computer testing centers at every university in the United States and Canada, plus commercial testing centers, that candidates could find a place within driving distance of their home. Most tests only last between 90 minutes and 5 hours. No longer do candidates have to take 3 days worth of assessment. Because the computer adaptive testing is so efficient at tailoring the questions to the candidate, most candidates didn't have to take very many questions. Most candidates finished, the one you saw a minute ago was an exception. Most candidates finished at the minimum right after between 60 and 65 questions. One thing that is all the rage, and the reason I brought it up here, one of the things you might have read about in the United States is the United States is once again going through a curriculum reform. I've been through 3 myself. You live long enough, you will be through 3 or 4 or 5, because the United States seems to try to solve its education problem every 10 years. They can't seem to solve their language problem by teaching more than one language, but they can try to change their curriculum. What they're trying to do now is get a curriculum that is much more similar to what the rest of the world has. It is a problem-solving curriculum. It is a critical analysis curriculum. It is a college readiness curriculum. It is no longer a simple facts and knowledge curriculum. It's called the Common Core. And the Common Core state standards have done something that Americans refuse to believe. It has shown that most American students who go to college are woefully unprepared to be successful. They haven't taken the rigorous coursework in high school to be successful. What that means is our assessments are very difficult. Our new assessments are very difficult for all the students. Almost none of the students pass. But through computer adaptive testing, we can still get information from the students who don't pass to identify areas of strengths and weaknesses that they will then be able to receive remediation or improved instruction upon. I, as a teacher, can target them. I brought that up because it seems in this era of teacher evaluation and the mission that you all have, and some of the themes in this conference are asking questions about how can we better evaluate not just teacher candidates, but our teachers themselves in an efficient manner that would give them feedback to help them understand where they needed to improve. And I'm thinking that maybe computer adaptive tests might be one of the tools you could use to help with that mission. I'm going to wait until the end. We'll have some time at the end of my talk to have some questions, but let's wait until the end so that we can get through this in a relatively painless manner. Some of the problems with cats, sometimes it's referred to as cats gone bad, is the fact that we need to, often in an assessment, we need to control the content. In other words, I'm not interested just in how the candidates do in math. I might be interested in how they do in specific areas in math. So I'll need to stratify my cat to make sure that the computer asks questions in those areas. And that hurts the efficiency of the cat. We'll see an example of that. We already talked about the large item pool. Some other interesting issues, and you probably all experienced this as well. When you're making a paper for a student to sit, you don't put two answers on the paper that clue each other to what the correct answer is. You know that because you see it and you say, I've already got a question like this on the test, so you avoid it. When the computer, however, is selecting the question, the computer doesn't know if this question conflicts with or cues a previous item administered. It's called cluing. Sometimes it's called an enemy. It interferes with students' ability to answer the question. Because the computers are dumb, they don't realize that. So that's a problem that we'll have to overcome if we want to go to computer adaptive testing. The other problem with computer adaptive testing is often test questions are associated with stimulus. Often math questions belong with a graph or a table of data. Reading questions or literacy questions are associated with a passage or a stimulus. And it's not very efficient to make a candidate read 2 pages of a literature selection and ask them just one question about reading. So we have this problem of stimulus that we have to address in the CAT. We have ways to solve all these dilemmas. Here's just an example of this content stratification I talked about. So grade 3, that would be your age 7 or 8, if I got the conversion right. Perhaps we want a test that has 30 questions in math from numeric reasoning, 12 from algebra, 9 from geometry, and 9 from quantity. Maybe we have a fixed length test that would have 59 questions in it. So what I'll have to do in the CAT is I'll constrain that. I'll tell the CAT, when you pick your questions, you have to pick at least 20 questions from numeric reasoning. Still adaptively, you will pick the 20 questions based on the student's ability, but you're forced into this subcategory, numeric reasoning, to do your item selection. Well, as you can see, the efficiency isn't nearly as great anymore. Now the CAT might have 40 items, where the paper and pencil test had perhaps as many as 60. It's still more efficient, but it's not as efficient as the example I gave previously. The problem, of course, is there are other subcategorizations of the content that also are important. So for example, under grade 3 numeric reasoning, there are these 2 objectives, number sense and operations. And each of those has more content classification. So if you try to stratify by all the content classification you want to make, the adaptive test actually becomes longer than the paper test because of the way it needs to adapt to get the best question for the students. Each of these are just representations. So if numeric reasoning was NR, number sense would be subdomain 1 of NR, and then demonstrate an understanding would be subdomain NR 1.1. What this really means, though, is that when you get to the CAT algorithm, you're not just picking the best math item. You're picking the best math item out of a whole list of math items that you have to select. Again, numeric reasoning now might have as few as 18, but as many as 22 items just that the CAT has to administer before estimating any student ability just to cover the content. So the content stratification for CAT is a big problem. It's a big problem if you're trying to build an assessment that covers a large range of instruction. But if you were to use CAT on a daily basis to cover the lesson plan or the information that you taught the student that day to understand mastery of what the student has learned in that particular instruction, that instruction is very specific. So you won't be burdened with this additional content stratification. This typically occurs in large-scale summary assessments. As we've talked already, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, there has to be a large pool of items. The CAT itself, the Computer Adaptive Test, doesn't really care how large the item pool is. If there was one item in the pool, it would administer that one item over and over and over again. If there were 10 items, it would administer the 10 items over and over again. The larger your pool, the more able computer adaptive testing is to find the very subset of items that students need the most. That's why large pools are required, and that's why as we start out to build computer adaptive tests, we need to think about all the assessments that we are currently doing to harvest all of those items to put into these large item pools. Item exposure. If you build assessments, this is what you find out. That the computer selects the very best questions for students of different abilities. So if you had a pool of, say, 100 questions, your very best questions, let's say the 5 very best questions, would likely always get presented to every candidate. If you're worried about cheating, if you're worried about candidates stealing the test questions, everybody gets exposed to the same 5. Those 5 items become corrupt. So you have to worry about how often you replace your items in a computer adaptive testing pool if you're worried about exposing the test questions. Again, if the CAT is for instruction and you use it as part of your routine teaching and learning cycle, you might not care if the items are exposed. As long as they work, they haven't been gamed or cheated, so that you know what the students can and can't do after a computer adaptive test is administered. We talked a little bit about item overlap. The easiest way to deal with item overlap, that is an item that might clue another item to the correct answer, is when you put them into the pool, you will classify the item at the lowest level of its classification. It's an operations item under number sense for numeric reasoning at grade 3, and you inspect the other items that are in that pool. There might be 10 items at that level of the pool to see which ones are the enemies or which ones that item might clue, and you just flag it so that the algorithm then knows not to ever present those 2 items together. It's a relatively simple way for the computer adaptive algorithm to identify and select items that are not going to clue each other. There are typically 2 strategies around using computer adaptive testing with stimulus. I think I'm a believer of the first strategy. If I'm going to make a student read 2 pages worth of a literary selection, I'm going to then want the computer to select items out of the pool associated with that passage so that the student can benefit the most from what they've read. In other words, the computer adaptive algorithm will work, but it'll only present items associated with that passage, so that the student might get 4 or 5 or 6 items associated with that passage before moving on to the next passage. Typically, this is called a testlet. I'll put together a little mini test associated with that passage, and then the computer can adapt the items inside that mini test before it moves to the next stimulus. Other ways of doing that is that you can have the algorithm search for passages the student has already read and make sure that they select questions from passages the student has already read. This becomes a problem with programming, frankly, And as such, it's not something that we use very often. So again, I think we've established some ground rules for CAT. The idea is that CAT will target students' abilities with the right questions, that CAT needs a large pool of items, and that there are concerns about cluing and content stratification that have to be taken into account with CAT. Talk a little bit about some of the ways people have moved to CAT around the world without going into item level specific CAT adaptability. Talk a little bit about how to deal with simulations, innovative item types, etc. Probably the most often used and easiest way, and you've probably done this yourself in the classroom, is a multi-stage adaptive test, which simply means, and I'll show you a picture of it, that instead of adapting at the item level, you create forms of the test: hard form, middle form, easy form. And that you give your student, your very best students, the more difficult form. You give your least able students the easiest form. There we go. Here's an example of a multi-stage adaptive test. So what you would have is everybody would take one, maybe 10-item test, could be larger, and it would contain a few specific items, a few field test items, maybe a passage and a few items. But based on their performance here, instead of routing them to the next test question, the CAT algorithm will say, okay, based on your performance on the routing test, we're going to have you take this difficult test. Based on your performance here, you're going to go to the medium test or you're going to go to an easier test. So it still adapts to the student, but it does it in blocks of test questions, not at the item level. And you can have as many stages of this as you want to build to get the level of precision that you want in your testing. The next stage shows a 4-level test. So the student starts in the middle, is either routed to middle difficulty, easy, high, but then based on their performance, if they get better, they might be routed back to the middle difficulty. If after stage 3 they do better yet, they might be routed to the 4th test, right? That's a harder test. So this particular student went this direction through the test and got 4 types of adaptive, all in fixed forms. So this might be 20 items, 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 so that you only have 10 20-item testlets, and the computer routes students through all those 10 via the permutations you see here. It's a much easier concept, a lot easier to put in place than a paper and pencil program as well. This is a variation of the test that Pearson works with ETS on for the PISA assessment. This is how the PISA assessment from OECD is arranged in testlets like this. I think I've talked about this. I want to get to the next slide. Well, we've talked about, again, I can't stress enough, moving from your current paper form, and this is going to be difficult. I used to teach teachers in colleges of education, and there's nothing worse than teaching seniors in high school, teachers, or nursing students, because they all have all the answers already. And so when you talk to your teachers, if you want to try to experiment with this idea of harvesting the pool of test questions, getting all your professors who write exams in all their different subjects to put those exams into a pool, that is a very powerful way to get started with moving that stuff online or to a computer adaptive test. But it's going to take some convincing because they are not likely to think that's a good idea. That's the best way to build these pools of items. The other thing that you have to have is we have to have statistics on these items. Again, they don't have to be something as sophisticated as item response theory, but we have to know how hard the test questions are relative to the population of candidates. So we need scores. That's the second part of harvesting this data from your professors that's going to be a challenge. They're not likely to want to be able to track multiple years' worth of data on multiple test questions. It's a hard process. An electronic item bank would help a lot. A grade book would help a lot. But again, this is the task of trying to get these pools of items with data to be able to do the things that we need. The other big threat to computer adaptive testing that we've seen is every teacher I know wants to keep changing the test questions every time. Tweak it here, change it here, add a response option there, change the scoring rubric a little bit. That then makes a new item in the pool, which is fine, but it also means now I'm starting over from the CAS perspective. I got a new item, I got to get new data, and I got to include it into a pool full of other like items. We talked a little bit about the fixed form transitions. I think I'm going to skip over that. I want to talk a little bit about something called a barely adaptive test, because I think it shows some of the powers of computer adaptive testing. So if you have item level adapting, which the algorithm selects the next best question for the student, then you've got multi-stage testing, where the algorithm selects the next best set of questions. Now we're going to talk a little bit about barely adapting, which means that we're essentially going to take the current fixed paper form and route a subset of those items to students based on the adaptive algorithm. Here's an example of the problem we're trying to solve. If you had a standard paper and pencil test, and these were the test questions, and these were the easy questions, and these were the hard questions, typically they would distribute themselves like this. There'd be a few questions that were easy, a few questions that were hard, but most of the questions would be in the middle. The problem then you can see right away is if I've got a student who isn't very able, they have at most maybe 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe 6 questions that are in their neighborhood to be able to show what they can do. They have to take all these questions in the pool, but they're very likely to only have a chance at answering these 6 questions. So forcing them to take that test wastes their time and doesn't give you, as the instructor, very much information. Now, if you have a class of students in the middle and you build a test like this for the students in the middle, then you've done fairly well. Now they've got some easy questions they have to show. Again, they're likely to get all these right, but they'll have some difficult questions that they'll have to show their ability on. They're not likely to get all these questions right. They're most likely to get these questions nearest them, tells you the most information about that middle ability student. And then with your bright students, you got just the opposite problem. You've got your very bright students here. There might be only 4 questions on the whole test that challenge those bright students. And you wonder why students or candidates hate testing. Well, most of them get tests that are way too hard for them or way too easy for them. Most students hate tests because of that reason. So if we could figure out a way to make this scenario easier, then we could solve some of the motivation problems we have with students, plus we could provide ourselves some feedback about how we can target those students for instruction. Having a test built like this, when all of my students are on the lower end of the scale, tells me almost no information not only about the students, but it doesn't tell me any information about these items. Hardly anybody's going to get any of these items right, so I can't tell if those items are how hard those items are compared to each other. If I could build a test where I had one test that had all these items in it, I would be a genius. Because then I've got a test that selects students that has questions for students at the low end, questions for the students in the middle, and questions for the students at the high end. I often can't do that. I'm not able to build tests that look like that. What the computer can do, however, is the computer can look at all these questions and only give the red questions to students near the red ability, the black questions to the students in the middle, and the blue questions to the students at the top. This is an example of a barely adaptive test. These people at the top still took items that were below their ability, but they didn't have to take all of the items below their ability. The computer algorithm is set up so that they stopped after a certain period of time administering questions below their ability. It doesn't use up as big an item pool. It targets the item pools at 3 levels of ability, right, and solves most of our dilemmas if we can get to that. Again, this is just another picture of the problem we have. If all of my students or all of my items are clustered in the middle of this ability continuum, I have no information at the end. I have to figure out, because in my classroom, I've got students that are very able and not very able. So how can I build assessments? Computer adaptive testing in any one of the 3 forms we've seen, barely adaptive, multi-stage, or item adaptive, can build tests that will accommodate this problem because they'll have questions at both ends. Again, here's another picture of, I got one item pool. This might be a conventional paper and pencil test. And using a barely adaptive algorithm, I will tell the computer, only select the easiest questions for these kids, only select the middle questions for these kids, and only select the most difficult questions for these kids. So I can do computer adaptive testing without having to build these huge item pools if I'm willing to give up some flexibility in how adaptive the test can be. I think I just said that, barely adaptive testing is just a compromise. You don't have to build huge item pools. You can use the current set of items. You can use your current paper test form. You don't get as much precision, but you get more precision than you do from just the paper form. I don't know if you have this problem here, but I used to think it was a problem in the U.S. only, this concept of off-grade level testing. In the United States, our schooling was set up based on agriculture. So students would go to school based on their ages because older students had to stay home on the farm and help parents out with the farm chores. And that's kind of stuck into our culture in the United States. Much to my surprise, when I went to India, it's exactly the same way in India. It's exactly the same way in the UK. It's a lot like this in China, but not exactly. And the problem is, it violates everything you know about learning. Students progress at different speeds through the prerequisite skills required, and those prerequisite skills in the rate at which they progress through that learning is often independent of age. Not always, it's correlated with age, but it's not dictated by age. So if we have tests, for example, 6th grade tests are built on 6th grade concepts, and I'm teaching 6th graders 6th grade concepts, and I have students who are behind who are at 5th or 4th grade concepts, it doesn't make a lot of sense to give those students 6th grade assessments because they're learning at 5th and 4th grade levels. So we need to give off grade level tests to those students who are receiving instruction off grade level. There's a huge enigma, at least in the United States and in India and in the UK, that that's not allowed. That the students have to be measured on what they were taught. I completely agree. Students ought to be measured on what they were taught. But if they're 12-year-olds, but they're receiving 10-year-old curriculum, they ought to be measured on the 10-year-old curriculum, not the 12-year-old curriculum. Computer adaptive testing allows that to happen. It allows us to customize, tailor the assessment to the student's ability. Same with students with disabilities. Students with disabilities, that's what SWD stands for. Students with disabilities are often behind their peers and haven't caught up yet. Off-grade level assessment allow us to accurately understand what those students can't do yet so that we can tailor instruction to them so that we can get them caught up with their peers. Again, it seems that whenever we're having a discussion about assessments, we treat assessments as if they're completely independent of instruction. Our goal is to build assessments that measure what's in the lesson plan so that we can give real-time feedback to teachers during instruction so that they can tailor their instruction or take note of what remediation they might have to do for what students at what particular point in time. Only a computerized test, and I argue CAT, will allow us to do that in real time. That's why I think we're going to have to start embracing computerized testing and computer adaptive testing just as soon as we can in order to integrate that assessment with instruction. So I want to close, and I'm getting close to the end here. I want to close with just a couple of thoughts about what computer adaptive testing and computers can do in the future. And I'll start with this scenario that I've described already. It's called computer adaptive testing. But I'll use a more generic term. Instead of test question, I'll just say activity. It could be projects. It could be book reports. It could be reading assignment. It could be anything, just activity. So I'll give the activity, I'll score and give feedback. From that, I know something more about the student. I know what that student can and can't do. Now in my lesson plan, I might tailor my lesson plan. When I create the next activity, I won't just create it in isolation. I'll create it knowing how well that student did on the previous activity I gave. So I'll build a new activity adapted to that student, and then we'll start the process over again. When I was teaching, that was called the teach, feedback, repeat loop. I would teach, I would get feedback, I would adjust my teaching, I'd do it again. This is a standard concept that's built into adaptive testing. When we talk about adaptive learning, it's exactly the same paradigm, adaptive learning. Only now, what I'm talking about is I'll give an activity, I'll score the activity, I'll update the skill profile. Now I'll think, okay, that student knows something about whatever. How can I challenge that student to get to a higher level of achievement? How can I drive learning into that student? The student knows measures of central tendency. Maybe I will now challenge the student to explain the similarities between measures of central tendency and measures of dispersion. I got to give the child an activity that will help them learn, right? Adaptive learning. It's exactly what our tutorials and our online programs strive to do. I want to adapt now based on what I know that student was able to do at the last instructional module I gave them. This is what serious games is all about. If you think about, it doesn't have to be your students. It can be your teacher candidates. It can be your spouses. If you think about the amount of time and energy and money people are spend playing games of all sorts, simulation games, 3D adventure games, World of Warcraft is one that comes to mind. These serious games have the motivation for the students. Students will spend hours trying to get to the next level of these serious games because they're interested and they're highly motivated. In serious gaming, if we can build learning into serious gaming, and most of the world's problem-solving assessments, critical analysis assessments do exactly this, build in real problem-solving skills, then we can create a game where, again, we'll give an activity, we'll score the activity, we'll figure out what the kid knows about that particular skill problem-solving, Right? Then we'll select the next most motivating problem-solving task. They really liked, I noticed from my previous activity, they really liked and did well at being able to figure out how to get the door open, how to break into the treasure chest. Right? So they seem to enjoy puzzles or problems. So now I will give them a more difficult problem, a problem that might include 3 variables, as my next activity, and see how well they do with that. Serious gaming. So we can even build learning into gaming and make gaming highly motivational for students so that they want to take remediation, because again, they won't really realize that learning is taking place. I always stick this in here. You know, psychometricians have a bad rap. And the reason psychometricians have a bad rap is when it comes to assessment, they always tell you the same thing. You can't do this. You can't do that. This isn't a fair measure. This isn't a valid measure. This isn't an accurate measure. Psychometricians are going to have to change to build assessments that will improve learning in the next generation. We're no longer going to be able to rely on the traditional models of psychometrics. Lee Cronbach is one of the fathers of modern psychometrics, and he admits that for us to build assessments that will help us improve learning in the future, we're going to have to build assessments that don't look anything like the assessments we currently have. I think computer adaptive testing is one of those. I am at the end of my program. Here are my, Beto, this is just killing me. I will just say that, again, we have handouts in the back, has my contact numbers on it, has my website on it, my email address. So if you have questions or you want to communicate with me, pick up one of those handouts and feel free to drop me an email or visit our website. It's the last slide, Roberto. While he's setting that up, I'll pause here before we break. Any questions or comments for me from the audience? This is not a particularly good forum for asking questions, but I'll be happy to entertain any questions anybody has.